It's my honor tonight to introduce our guest who's going to speak to us about the acronym CBRNE, which is Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, and High-Yield Explosives. James Burghard is a 23-year military veteran that served in several branches of the military. He helped in a specialized unit designed to help first responders in such an event. And he's also a 20-year volunteer firefighter, hazmat specialist, and currently teaches for Texas A&M around the country, training police, firefighters, and various other agencies on how to manage large-scale disasters. So with that, Dr. James Burghard.
Oh yeah, exactly. The acronyms.
That's good.
I guess I could start with, I'm not from Colorado Springs, but I graduated from the high school in Colorado Springs, so that's close enough, right? You know? So
Which high school?
Cheyenne Mountain.
All right.
So all right. So when Kathleen approached me and asked me to talk about it, like I said, I spent about 23 years in the military across the Army, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard. 20 years as a firefighter. She's like, well, can you speak about CBRNE? And I'm like, well, yeah, I could definitely talk about that. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, one I spend a lot of time working on and now training other first responders on. Then how do you distill it down to 45 minutes? Because it's such a large topic that I probably could speak all day and go on for days about it. So kind of thought process as I work through what to talk about tonight. Talk a little bit about emergency response and kind of what that traditionally looks like in the world. I know I get to watch a lot of Hollywood, and my wife hates going to movies with me or TV shows because I'll be like, well, that's not real. That's not how we do it. And so after a while, she's like, just enjoy the show, right? So I figured I'd talk about a little bit about response because I know everybody that does all the hard work. I work with Kathleen a little bit on some of her books. Everybody's trying to get this realism that brings your audience into this world of where they feel like they don't get kicked out of it because they're like, well, that's not how it is, and all of a sudden your story is unbelievable. So talk a little bit about response, and then go into the CBRNE side of it, and kind of talk about what each one is a little bit, and then the different levels, because Hollywood, the news, and other things have done some great things to sensationalize. It's a big word for me tonight. Sorry about that. Sensationalize different things, and how realistic are those scenarios, and how can you possibly use those? So talking about responses, the key word we use when we teach new first responders and all the work we do is it starts and ends locally. So every response is going to start with your local fire, law enforcement, and EMS agencies. And at the end of the day, they get the keys turned back over, no matter how big or how ugly it gets there, no matter how many federal agencies show up. Eventually, your local agencies will have to close it out because they own it because they're the local jurisdiction. Like Kathleen mentioned, I've been a volunteer firefighter. If you don't know, within the U.S. right now, it's roughly about 70 to 80% of your firefighters in this country are volunteers, only leaving about 20 to 30% of your firefighters to be paid, which a lot of people don't know. It's a statistic that doesn't really hang out there a lot, but it's something that's important to understand as you write stories and as you're looking at how fast do we respond. You're going, well, it took a while for them to get here. Well, depending on where you live, they're all volunteer firefighters. They have other jobs, other lives. They have to run to a firehouse, get in the fire truck, and show up. And so that kind of delays the response. So that's kind of something to think about. Major cities, New York, Denver, Fort Collins, almost the whole Front Range now are all paid fire departments, but it doesn't take very long to drift off the beaten path, and you'll find volunteer fire departments, which is kind of what I spent my career working on, from Alaska to Colorado, and then eventually finished my career up in Wyoming. So mostly rural departments. Loveland Fire Department, Loveland Fire Rescue, before they became bigger as they are now. I was a volunteer there before they ended that program. So yeah, so it's key that always starts in locally, volunteers. Every firefighter, and I'll speak to firefighting because that's kind of my background. I do dip my toes a little bit in the law enforcement side, but that's not my expertise. So I'll speak to this a lot from the fire side of the world. So every firefighter is hazmat trained. So the first responding engine or apparatus that shows up, every firefighter has some basic knowledge of hazmat, which CBRNE falls within. Those first responding agencies traditionally are all defensive in nature. So if you see them standing back and not doing much, that's because that's what they're trained to do. We talk about denying and isolating access to an incident. And we only take risks early on for life safety. If somebody's in there that could be saved or viable patients. But after that, I think Hollywood likes to make it look like it's all exciting all the time, but we really slow down at that point. Once we save the lives we can save within an incident, it really crawls down to this slow, methodical response process. So if you drive by an incident going, it looks like they're standing around doing nothing, and there's a semi truck turned over, leaking something. That's just the nature of our industry. We risk a lot to save a lot. We risk a little to save a little, right? So that's the mantra we kind of use. If I'm going to risk send a firefighter, I retired as a lieutenant. So if I sent one of my firefighters into an incident, it was going to be to have a high chance to rescue or save somebody, but not risk their lives to just to drag a body out, right? So that's kind of how we work. You know, thinking about what kind of interesting things, how do you distill down CBRNE and hazmat to people that aren't familiar with it? So we teach new firefighters because they love donuts. There's a donut technique, and I know cops like this too, because who doesn't like a donut, right? So hazmat's all about a donut. So you get yourself a powdered donut, and you can respond to any hazmat incident in the world. So the first rule about the donut is you got to be able to fit the incident inside the hole in the middle of it. So if you're so close to it that you can see the flames blowing out the side or smoke coming out the side, you are way too close. Back up until the donut hole fits the whole incident, right? The other part why it's got to be powdered donut, if the wind's blowing and the powder's blowing in your face, you're on the wrong side of the incident. Go to the other side so the powder blows away from you, right? And the final part why it's got to be a donut, if you try to roll it and it rolls back towards you and not towards the incident, you're on the wrong side of the hill, right? So we teach young firefighters, and I figure a lot of people that don't know hazmat, a powdered donut is something you can take home and remember about how do you respond to an incident. And it's simplistic, but it's what we do. We stand upwind, we stand uphill, and we try to stand back as far, because distance is the best safety measure. Further away you can get from a bad substance, whether any of the CBRNE and any of these are items. That's where safety comes from. So that's kind of the donuts, the basic thing. So within fire departments, depending, again, now this is where we're geographically different. So a good friend of mine is the chief over FDNY, New York Fire Department's WMD CBRNE response organization. So they have a whole entity of trained people that's their whole job. You come out to Colorado, you'll get hazmat teams in the big city fire departments. You go up to Wyoming, we have some of our bigger departments have hazmat teams, but after that, we go down to regional hazmat teams because that's what we can afford and that's what we can staff. So again, based off where you set a story, you get quite a different response when it comes to hazmat and how capable they are. Like Kathleen mentioned, I was a hazmat tech. I'm actually a hazmat specialist within CBRNE. I spent, like I said, I think about 2005 is when I really got heavy into it. When I finished my career about 2017 in the military, like I said, spent that 12 years kind of working through that process. So we'll kind of talk about CBRNE and what does that look like and what's possible and feasible and what's maybe not so realistic. So I'll go down the list. So the chemical, right? So which kind of covers everything. So within the United States, roughly, it's guessed there are 3,000 what we call TICs and TIMs, which are toxic industrial chemicals and toxic industrial materials. That's what this country has running around, from everything from automotive manufacturing to farming to everything that just exists within our world, because that's what we need to make furniture, clothing, or various other products. So those are plentiful, and they're what you see running up and down your highway every day, and different trucks marked with little hazmat placards that you see on them. The fancy ones that everybody likes to jump on board with, Sarin, VX, the military grade things, those are highly controlled. I've had opportunity probably, let me see, over my career, one time inside of a controlled facility to test it. And then another time during Hurricane Harvey, they were demilitarizing old Sarin and VX rounds, and they were impacted by the hurricane. They were actually outside and they knocked over the round, like the storm knocked over the rounds, things like that. But very rarely do you run into those. Those take a full, barring Breaking Bad out there, they take a full laboratory. So usually nation states are the ones that have those kind of chemicals. So that would take the US, Russia, the UK, other major nations like that. Occasionally, if you have a nation state that's willing to sell to to terrorist organizations, that's how they would get it. But to make your own sarin and VX, that's kind of a struggle. It takes a pretty good scientific mind and a lot of equipment that is pretty heavily regulated. If you ever try to buy pseudoephedrine, because we track that because it's used for making methamphetamines, a lot of the chemicals that go and make sarin and VX are the same way. They're tracked the same thing. So if you ask to buy any of the precursors or items, you'd make it. They are a little more troublesome to buy because they want a driver's license and address that's being shipped to and those kind of items. So it makes them a little bit more problematic. But those ticks and TIMs I talk about, if you don't know, sarin and VX are actually cousins to most pesticides that exist within the world. They act very similar. So most of us, when we train for concerns about CBRNE, obviously being worried about somebody making sarin and VX, we train to that because it could happen. But bigger concerns were different pesticides that would have the same reaction on a human as one of those, and those are less regulated, more easily abundant, especially getting out here into Colorado, Nebraska, all the farm country. A lot of farmers, it's strictly a padlock that keeps their pesticides controlled. That's a matter of a pair of bolt cutters, and you have access to a chemical that's highly carries a kind of same threat. So that's kind of the basics of CBRNE, or the C in CBRNE. Like I said, we mostly concern ourselves with the like I said, the chemicals that exist within this country, because everything else, while not impossible, just not as likely as a threat. When it comes to response, we recently changed. If you've ever seen hazmat teams out there, the big, people call them like the Martian suits or space suits or the marshmallow suits, whatever different nicknames they have. That used to be our go-to. They make for great television because, you know, obviously people easily recognize them, but unfortunately we've actually gone back to using our structural firefighting gear as our primary response, because we figured out of those 3,000 ticks and TIMs, like 2,800 and something, or 2,900 or something, I can't remember what the number is, are all flammable. And those plastic suits don't do well with flames. Only roughly 12 chemicals in the US in current production require that high level hazmat suit. So we figured out it was a better idea to wear our firefighting gear, which protects us from fire from that, than the 12 chemicals which chlorine's on that list. A couple other chemicals that are pretty prevalent, but that's kind of where we are for that. So then we move into the B, the biological. And I know obviously we just went through one, right? COVID. I think we're 3 years, right? It's a couple of years old now. But obviously that's kind of everybody's recent exposure to biologicals. But I've had experience working with everything from anthrax to bubonic plague, botulinum toxin. There's lots of different agents out there that are talked about. Again, as we saw with COVID, and like I said, I won't get into the politics of it or not, but obviously there's some concerns about whether it came out of a laboratory or not. Those higher level, higher contagious diseases, again, take a state actor. They take a nation state or somebody with enough money and funding to stand up a laboratory. But if you don't know, things like anthrax are endemic to almost all of Wyoming. Anywhere the cattle industry is pretty heavily involved, you can dig up some soil, send it to a lab for testing, and they'll come back and say it's positive for anthrax. It's not the weaponized anthrax that we saw when we had concerns about the white powder envelopes, especially post 9/11, but it's still anthrax nonetheless. So there's that concern. If you don't know, in Wyoming and Colorado, there's plague. The black plague actually exists. The brown squirrels and the prairie dogs carry it. They actually carry the fleas that carry it. So that's still running around out there. That's why we always yell at our dogs when they go outside and there's a dead brown squirrel or something like that. We're like, please don't get that. I don't need to bring black plague in my house. But things like that exist. I've had the chance to make you can make botulinum toxin fairly easily, but it's not scalable. Like I can make it in about the size of a soup can over a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks at the most, but that's not scalable if I'm trying to kill a lot of people again, right? That's where the problem with biologics becomes. They takes a lot of effort, but I will tell funny stories. So I had a class come in, instructors were coming in from out of state to teach us as hazmat techs on biological chemical agents. We went to Walmart, bought things you could source locally, and the lady at the cash register said, well, what's all this for? We're like, oh, we're making a the biological lab. And she's like, oh, that's so cute. And we're like, yeah, nobody's ever noticed, right? But yeah, biologics are a struggle a little bit because again, they do take a little bit more than just what you could do in your home lab. Now there are, like I said, botulinum toxin. You can do anthrax. It's not weaponized anthrax, so it's not as deadly as the full weaponized that comes from a nation state actor. But again, those are just the things to think about scalability when it comes to all these different threats. There's things I can do in my home, in my garage, and I can kind of ad lib a little bit. But there's some things I just can't, you can't go through without. And the level of laboratory you need for some of these biological productions is pretty sophisticated. So barring again, a nation like Russia, maybe China, North Korea, those that are more friendly with threat actors, it's definitely difficult production to kind of get to. So the popular ones I know are radiological nuclear. So I figure I spend a little bit more time on the two in the middle because it seems to be the what a lot of people like to write stories about or what the movies like to use about. So they're broken into two pieces for a reason. So the R is radiological, and I'll start with N. I'll skip over the R for a second. So nuclear, those are fusible weapons built for a purpose to be a device, right? That's not a garage made thing. That's again with Cheyenne. We have F.E. Warren Air Force Base, home of our strategic nuclear ballistic missiles, is out of there. What you see on nuclear submarines and things like that. Those are nuclear devices, right? So those go under very high control. It takes a scientific laboratory to build them. Outside of currently a couple of wayward Russian suitcase bombs that are, they're not sure where they went after the fall of the Soviet Union and that kind of thing. Our biggest threat for nuclear right now, our concern would be probably Pakistan. We're just not overly thrilled with the security of their weapons, and if they had a coup or something like that, what would happen to those weapons that are currently in that nation? But other than that, a nuclear weapon, a true nuclear weapon, what we would call a nuclear weapon, is what, like I said, is built by the U.S. government, built by Russia, Israel, or any of the other nations that currently have a nuclear stockpile. Now, the radiological side is kind of where we get a little more creative, and that's where the famous term dirty bombs live. This is taking some sort of radiological material and then dispersing it, whether physically dispersing it or, as the name dirty bomb implies, using explosives to try to disseminate this and cause issues. They get a lot of Hollywood press because they are kind of scary in the sense of radiation doesn't look like anything. It could be from anything from salts to liquids to powders to solids. And you wouldn't know it's in front of you until either you're sick or you walk away and it wasn't strong enough to hurt you. So that's kind of an interesting area. The dirty bomb was not, when we talked about it, was not a concern to us. The problem with dirty bombs is you literally take any type of radiation source. Guys were trying to steal older smoke detectors used to have a radiation source in them, or what they could steal around from medical isotopes. You strap it to a bomb, you blow it up. The problem with that is the explosion destroys most of your material and the explosion. And if you use something like cobalt or something else that's a solid, that just leaves chunks everywhere. You just got to go out there with a little dust buster, sweep it up, and it's not a threat, right? Just don't eat it, right? You have a higher threat of dying from the explosive when it comes to a dirty bomb than the actual radiation if you just get away from it. So I know, like I said, a lot of things have made them very popular, and they seem like a scary thing when you think about it, but when you get down to the science side of it, which is kind of where we as CBRNE specialists live, it's really kind of more spooky than in like a movie spooky than it is in real life spooky. So that's kind of the thought process there. Now, the other side of radiological is just taking a radiological source and spreading it out in a common space and having people just gradually exposed to it. That's a threat, and that's why DOE and other agencies within the U.S. keep pretty tight regulatory control over all sources, and if a source comes up stolen or missing, those things are pretty highly controlled and regulated, but it does happen from time to time. Construction companies have radiation sources, the soil density gauges they use for the highways out here when they're redoing I-25 for the 5,000th time, or never finished in northern Colorado. Right. One of those semi trucks out there with a padlock on it has soil density gauges in it, and those have radiation sources in them. So as good a security as you get. That's kind of where you are for, unfortunately, for radiation. But then everything else is medical grade. That travels around this country day in, day out. Part of the job I did, and what I teach now is sports and special events. And that's kind of where our concerns are. So for a better part of 12 years, I spent working Cheyenne Frontier Days, which, if you don't know, is the largest rodeo in the world, or largest outdoor rodeo in the world, I should say. We bring in, I think the number fluctuates anywhere from 200 to 300,000 people. So we spend that time searching the stands, carrying radiation detectors, chemical detectors with us, trying to keep everybody safe. And we wind up spending a lot of time finding chemotherapy patients and other type of radiation patients. So it becomes a good game of after they figure it out, or if they had chemo long enough, they know, like, I know if I go to any place populated, somebody will always come up and find me eventually. But those kind of sources are very, they travel a lot. Again, they are regulated. But again, if something goes missing, you know, if somebody misdocuments it, that's kind of the thought process there. So that's kind of the thought process behind radiation. The final one is explosives, which again has a lot of theatrical to it. This is the one part of the of CBRN where it's almost a chicken and egg here, because explosives generally fall under law enforcement for their EOD or their canine units to find and detect and locate. The issue is most modern explosives are chemically based. They're made in the chemical laboratory using a lot of science. Well, the question becomes up when we show up to response with the EOD team there and a hazmat team is who goes in first. The hazmat team will not make entry because there could be an explosive in there. And the EOD guys will not go in there because there could be a chemical in there, right? So then we stare at each other for a minute and think about, are we going to paper, rock, scissors to who goes in first, right? Because it's just a changing nature of our world. Before it was easy, right? You know, it was, you know, old dynamite found up on the mountain, right? That, you know, EOD guys are like, well, yeah, we've been finding that, you know, back in Grandpa's shed that he had from his old gold mining days or whatever. But now that most newer type of explosives like TATP and some of those other ones are chemical based. Now you start running into the issue of who makes entry first and who owns that incident, because again, it straddles what we look at as a traditional response area. So in Cheyenne, we got really good at it. We figured out a way to get a hazmat suit under a bomb suit. So our bomb guys will make entry with what we call level B, which is not the highest level of protection, but it is, they wear an SCBA and air pack that you see firefighters traditionally with their bomb suit. They're kind of trying to alleviate that, but it's definitely an area of contention about who owns it and then who's going to go in first. Because again, it's such a kind of dynamic situation. Everybody's from Colorado, right? So obviously the Aurora shooting suspect, he had a lot of chemicals in his apartment. So actually I came down to Colorado from Cheyenne. We thought we were gonna have to make entrance on it because the law enforcement had concerns about what was in his apartment, and we wound up going home because they figured out it was safe enough for them to make entry. But again, when you get to that the CBRN events and you get especially to the E, that kind of really crosses the jurisdictional or kind of traditional boundaries of where we live and work. So that's kind of that's a down and dirty. I don't know if that's enough of what you're looking for. But like I said, this is a topic I can spend days talking about. And like I said, it's funny when we develop exercises. So I'm teaching for Texas A&M University. It's called TEACS, which is we're contracted by FEMA to train local first responders. So it's free to the local agencies at no cost to them. FEMA pays us, and we travel around the country doing this. That's kind of what we do. We become bad guys and we think about all the possibilities of what's feasible and realistic. We use a scenario where we need to get an audience moving out of an arena. So we use bear spray because that's something we're like, I could walk down to any sporting goods store here in Colorado, right, buy mass quantities of it and nobody would ask any question about it, right? But bear spray is right on the level of just slightly less effective than law enforcement capsaicin, but not very much, not enough for you to care or know the difference if you're getting sprayed with it, right? But, but that's kind of what we work through is these scenarios that are feasible. Because again, that's what we want to train our first responders to. And I think that's what you want to do as writers is find a story where as you're writing it and developing it, the reader kind of sticks around with that and stays in there. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious. Remember the Oklahoma bombing with Timothy McVeigh? Could a person duplicate that?
Oh, very easy. And if you don't know, Timothy McVeigh messed up. He could have made that. He could have leveled that building. They actually found raw material that was after the explosion laying around because the way he did it, it wasn't as effective as you could be. We've actually walked through that scenario and figured out how you could have, and with how much material he had in that back of that van, that would have leveled the McMurray building, not taken off a piece of it.
Somebody could still go around.
It's hard. It's getting harder and harder because as we find those threats, we try to close those loopholes. Like I said, we try to make it like pseudo-ephedrine, where it's you have to show a driver's license, right? You have to get some sort of information, right? But we always say in our world that we have to be right 365 days a year. The bad guy has to be right once, right? And that's the unfortunate part of being a first responder is we try and try and try, but the bad guys will find a loophole. I mean, 9/11 is a prime example, right? Terrorists used to only hijack planes and take people hostage, and we'd give them some money or whatever they wanted, and then they'd release the hostages and life was over. They took a plane and flew it inside of a building. We're like, well, that's new, right? And so that had to change how we thought and view the processes. So we try to stay ahead of it. Like I said, that's what we do every day is as we develop training exercises, we try to be as realistic as possible and then push those boundaries within reason. So that way first responders start thinking a little bit more outside that box. Like I do a case study in the sports course I teach. I do a case study on the 1 October Las Vegas shooting, because that was a shooting that again went way outside of our normals, defeated every security measure we do because the venue was really secure, but not the hotel next to the venue wasn't secure, right? So that's again a scenario where we thought we had a good job, like we have metal detectors, we're not letting purses in, or they gotta be clear backpacks, all these items that we do to secure a special event. But he came up with that one bright idea, but I'll just shoot from a building next door and nobody will ever bother me, right? And it's Vegas, everybody's like, how do you get 23 firearms into a hotel room? That's easy, the bellman helps you, right? Because he was a high roller and Vegas is a conference venue. They're used to seeing Pelican cases and those kind of storage containers come and go on a daily basis, right? So it's not a big deal. But again, those things bad guys stretch our imagination. So we try to stretch our imagination a little bit when it comes to what's feasible. But like I said, within reason, like I said, some of these items like producing weaponized anthrax, that takes a legit laboratory, right? Like, I mean, so that would take somebody either with lots of money or a state actor, right? So that's kind of where we try to be realistic. It was funny during COVID. I spent the better part of 2 years in Texas, helping them with their COVID response. And then we wound up, I don't know if you watch news at all, but we wound up with an ice storm, with a power outage, with a water shortage, a food shortage, and a pandemic all rolled into about a week. So it was a pretty exciting week. And one of my bosses at that time goes, every time I sat through one of your training exercises, they were over far-fetched. All these things wouldn't happen at the same time. And then here we are with all these. So it's definitely very interesting about, we try to push the boundaries as far as what we think is reasonable. And sometimes our students think or first responders think they're unreasonable, but then COVID happens. And like I said, you have a power outage with an ice storm and everything else that went on down in Texas. And it's definitely an interesting experience.
How much do you interface with the Department of Homeland Security?
It depends on where you're at in the country. So it's like every agency. I noticed the Red Cross is parked out back here. When I talk about the Red Cross as I travel the country, I love the Red Cross. Have an amazing relationship with them. They help me out so much. But then I go to Georgia, where I was just at, and I ask them about the Red Cross, and they're like, "Oh, we'll never call them. Like ever. We don't like them." And the same thing comes to federal agencies. I've had the pleasure. So I did I guess it's only a couple blocks that way. The 2008 Democratic National Convention was here and hosted here at the convention center. So I got a chance there to work with Secret Service, the FBI, which brought their hazardous material response team, which they have their own hazmat team, and Homeland Security was there, the Postal Service. Pretty much almost every federal agency you can ever think of was there. And everybody I worked with, I've had great experiences, but then I've traveled to other parts of the country and run into those agents in those parts of the country, and I'm going, I don't know if I'd call you, right? So it just kind of depends, right? I think people impact our jobs, and we try to tell people you need to meet them before an incident. We are all first responders. I know the one gentleman said he worked for the DEA, so I'm sure he has the same feeling. We trust who we know, and we don't trust who we don't know, right? So if we've never met you before and you show up and you're like, I'm with EHS, I'm here to help, and I'll be like, you can go stand over there and drink a cup of coffee, and maybe I'll get to you later. But if I know you and have a working relationship with you, so that's kind of what we stress in our trainings, is that you get to know these people, try to invite different agencies. These sports complexes, like I was just in Georgia, and they have the Mercedes-Benz Dome, which is the home of the Atlanta Falcons. I know the assistant director for security for the Falcons. He's one of our instructors, and they have a great working relationship with all different federal agencies to state, local agencies, and it's a great environment. But you go to other places, and there's a lot of egos, unfortunately, in our industry. A great agency we work with, especially when it comes to the radiations, DOE, they have what they call RAP teams, which are radiation response teams. The one for Colorado and Wyoming comes out of Idaho National Laboratory, and the great guys to deal with. I mean, love them, work with them all the time. They actually have one guy, one of their engineers literally builds whatever equipment we want. We're like, hey, it'd be really cool to have a way to scan large areas for radiation. He goes, okay. And a short while later, he created these helped create these backpacks that we walk around with that can scan whole venues, carrying a backpack, right? And so yeah, I mean, so we have a great relationship with the guys like that. FBI for Wyoming, before I retired, the gentleman that was up there, I had a great working relation with him. He was on my speed dial if we thought it was going to elevate to a terrorist event, which does fall under the purview of the FBI. I would have no qualms about calling him because of the great relationships we have. But everything comes down to people, right? And so unfortunately, I wish I would say it wasn't, but.
Thank you. I had a question about biologics. You say it would take a nation or a state to develop something, but my thoughts flew immediately to graduate students in labs and CRISPR technology. And it seems to me that it would just take one unhinged grad student with CRISPR to really be a problem.
It could be, right? I mean, we hope that the university's doing what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be regulated and controlled. So, like I've had a lot of experience working with the University of Wyoming. They have a whole controlled facility where they control every ounce of research material that could be possibly hazardous. At one point, we did a training exercise there, and our radiation equipment went off. So we left the building because we're like, oh, we're not going to be in here with radiation. Kept going in there, and the instructors who were doing the training were like, why do you guys keep leaving? We're like, there's radiation in there. It was like, we did not put any radiation in the building. We're like, there's radiation in the building. Well, they had depleted uranium in the building, the university did, and we weren't aware of it, but it was locked and secured in the facility where it should be. But yeah, those universities have pretty tight control on it. Again, it's like I said, we have to rewrite 365, but we control it pretty heavily. Texas A&M University actually has one of the few nuclear reactors on campus. They actually have a educational reactor that they use to do different scientific experiments and research into radiation and different items tied to that. And I think right now, I want to say last count, there's 5 or 6 of those in the US with no issues or problems because of how regulated and how controlled they are. But again, not a terrible premise to a book or a way to get an idea across.
If you have a protagonist who's looking to develop a dirty bomb or something like that, where in the United States is the area that medical, whatever, that is probably the most vulnerable, where someone might be able to walk away with some radiological types of.
I know, again, it's so highly regulated. That comes back to the problem, right? Like every place where we send radiation, the DOE knows where it's going, where it came from. So it's definitely a struggle. So yeah, that's that's the hard part. I mean, hospitals obviously have an abundance because of, but a lot of what they have are what we call short half-lives. They're designed to, they deteriorate fairly rapidly because we don't want it in your body very long at a high dosage, because then it would kill you, not treat your cancer, it would kill you. But again, those deteriorate so quickly that like iodine 131, which is the one, if you have a thyroid cancer, it's how they treat thyroid cancer. I want to say right now, if you get treated with iodine 131, it's 5 days of isolation that you can't be around other people, because it's strong enough that it would irradiate your thyroid, whether you wanted it gone or not. But that's probably the strongest one, but it only lasts about 5 days. And after 5 days, it's no longer a threat because it degrades to a point of safe, like it can be safely touched and dealt with. So that kind of becomes a problem, like when you're trying to look for those kind of sources. But old medical facilities, trying to remember, there's a famous YouTube video out there. If you look out there, and I want to say it's from Brazil, and I can look it up and find it, maybe get to Kathleen. But there was a big festival happening. People broke into an old medical facility. They found cobalt there, which was a kind of a liquid powder, and they started rubbing it on all, and they loved it because it glowed blue, and they're out there partying, and the next thing you know, you're like, people are getting sick and dying, and you're going like, well, we thought it was all safe and secure, but then obviously the party goers found it in an old medical facility. So it's not implausible, but it's, the US is a little different than Brazil as far as our control measures go. But again, it takes a little bit more of a well-crafted pen to find that way to, to thread that needle. I mean, but it's definitely something to think about. Yeah, question, Kathleen.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I found interesting is knowing you is to talk about your clearances. Because you have all this knowledge, like you could go out and do the attack. So
yeah, unfortunately, I'm regulated, right? So those of us that get trained, to a certain level, we get, I don't know if it's true or not, we get told we get put on the list, and if something happened in Cheyenne, Wyoming, I would be on the short list of, hey, where were you last night? And I'll be like, I was in Denver, and they were like, prove it. But yeah, I mean, we have to train our firefighters, our first responders to be capable of it. But again, could your threat actor come from within those ranks? And we'd hope not.
but your background checks, I guess that's what they were so intense.
Oh yeah. When you finally make it, yeah, I think it gets really bad when your neighbors call you in a panic going, some guy showed up at my front door, flipped a badge and asked questions about you. And I was like, I hope you said nice things, right? Like, because I didn't know they were going to go, so I didn't have a chance to warn my, because they tell you, like, ask you where have you lived in the past 10 years and who knew you at that address. Well, for certain clearances, they will actually go to those, knock on those doors. So they got a little badge flip guy and everything. So I'll go here first and then we'll get you.
With a military grade nuclear weapons,
yeah,
you have, I think it's all exclusively fission now. I don't think that maybe there's a fusion bomb.
They haven't told us yet if they have one, right? So
but when you talk about a dirty bomb, am I correct in that is not a nuclear explosion? It's an explosion that scatters radioactive stuff.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's the difference, right?
So it's not a nuclear explosion.
That's why they list it separately. One's
Right.
and the one's the N of CBRNE nuclear,
Right.
one's radiological, because it's
So a dirty bomb would have a relatively small geographic impact.
yeah, however much explosives you strap to it, that's how big the explosion is going to be. If people don't know, so the whole point, so a nuclear bomb, when we designed them in World War II, they were not, the point of them is not to irradiate and kill people through radiation. The problem was to make a big enough bomb to wipe out a city. It would, we have them now, they're called MOABs, the mother of all bombs. They're almost the size of this room, right? To get that much traditional explosives crammed into a bomb that would have that big explosion. What scientists figured out is, with this much radioactive material, you could build a bomb that could wipe out a city. So they were never built to kill you by the radiation. They were designed to be a high yield explosive
Right.
in a smaller package is the whole point of a nuclear device. So that's why it takes science to do it, because it's not just a matter of throwing explosives. There are explosives in nuclear devices, but that's the assist with the process, not part of the bomb part of it. But that's definitely the difference why we separate the two, because you look at them two different ways. If a nuclear bomb went off today downtown Denver, like, well, Denver's gone, right? Like, right, like, we're not gonna worry about Denver. We just gotta, how big of a bomb is how far out we start, right? We might be in Colorado Springs, because that might be as close as we could be. And that's where we'll start, right? Start from Cheyenne, start from Colorado Springs and see how close you can get. But yeah, that is the difference. And what distinguishes the two is one is a yield weapon, right? Where it actually fuses or has a fission reaction and then creates that explosion that we're familiar with.
So you get a couple sticks of dynamite and a couple of glow-in-the-dark watches.
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much.
CJ, did you have a question? I thought I saw you raise your hand. You have one? Oh.
Go back there and I'll go here.
Bruce, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Before I ask my question, I have to confess, I'm already brainstorming the scene involving a putter don't.
Okay.
So
Good.
I was quite intrigued with that. And actually, the question I had sort of related to that. I was quite struck by your comment that 70% of the firefighters are volunteers. Maybe this is a difficult question to answer exactly, but I'm curious, can you give me a rough idea of what size community at what point, like what kind of population?
Unfortunately, I can't.
Before you start to have a professional firefighter.
In Colorado and Wyoming, you will see that, like, as the community grows, you'll see that change over. But what breaks the rule is New York. So outside of New York City Fire Department, almost all the rest of the fire departments are volunteers. And that's New York, right? Where it's a super populated state. But that's just tradition. They've always been volunteer fire departments. They have no desire to become paid departments. Their great-great-grandfather was a firefighter and they're a firefighter, right? That's just the way it is. So unfortunately, while that would make the most sense, because that happens out here traditionally, you'll see, like, as a city grows, like I said, Loveland is where I was at early in my career. When Loveland was smaller, it was a combination department. So we had some paid, some volunteers, and then as they hit a threshold of growth, they had enough funding to go full paid. And so you do see that out west here. But then, like I said, you go back east and there's huge volunteer fire departments in cities that would be as big as Fort Collins, Loveland, things like that. And you're
50 or 100,000.
Yeah, it's easy. If not more.
I would typically think of it would be a few thousand
Yeah,
in a town.
yeah.
Before eventually you could afford that.
Yeah, so out west you'll see that more, but like I said, you go back to the East Coast, Pennsylvania's the same way, New Jersey, lots of volunteer fire departments where you would think this is a big enough city or rural or a suburb area that should be paid, and you'll drive by it, it'll be something township volunteer fire department, and you're like, really? Like, but it's a tradition, right? And out there it's funny because they use the tornado sirens we have out here. Those are out there for the volunteer firefighters. If you hear the tornado siren go off there, that's not a tornado's coming. That's them alerting the firefighters that there's a call that they need to either turn their radio on and hear what's going on, or just get to the fire station, right? But yeah, it's definitely a different world. Yeah, unfortunately, I wish I could give you like 100% this is the way it is, but there's so many broken rules in that, like I said, with the East Coast especially.
Yeah.
What a large volunteer department, several hundreds, would they tend to have at least a core of paid employees?
Not necessarily. So my department out of Cheyenne, it's actually one of the county departments, Cheyenne, or outside of Cheyenne, what do we had down to? I think we just dropped to 7 because a couple merged. But we're a combination department. We had 8 full-time staff and like 50 volunteers. But that's a fairly small area. I think our population is only 16,000 people. But then out in New York, they're 100% volunteer. They might have some paid administrator people that, keep the lights on, they, pay all the bills, do that kind of stuff. But as far as firefighters, they're all traditionally.
Would they have a paid chief, or would he?
They could be, or sometimes it's a volunteer as well. So a lot of tradition out back east when it comes to firefighters. So I know the gentleman in the back row had a question. I'll go with. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned the electrical grid. I think a couple of years ago, you kept seeing news stories about some people were trying to attack certain substations and that kind of thing. Any idea of what was going on
That one, no, not 100%. I mean, is it vulnerable? Yes, because they're out everywhere. I mean, you can drive down any country road, right, and find a 8-foot chain link fence is all the protection that there is. But obviously, nobody's found that a sufficient attack vector yet because nobody's done it. I mean, we had some minor stuff. The bigger threat for that now is the cyber side of that, because they can do a more wide spread attack on it. So that's kind of where we focus our efforts on, really not the like individual substation threats and things like that.
I got 2 questions for you. First, I think the term CRISPR, what's that?
Yeah, it's a CRISPR.
Yeah,
Oh, it's a gene editing application, gene editing tool that's available to, modify viruses and DNA links and genes.
okay, so bioengineering kind of.
Yeah.
And then, would a person who doesn't usually have had to have had a polygraph test?
Nope, never have. Now, like I said, my military security clearance, I think it's better than a polygraph because everything in my life that I've ever done down to my credit score is checked. And if you have which is the newest one that they added, once they started finding they had some loopholes where they were having some people that were selling spies or secrets to the Russians or Chinese or something like that. They were like, well, how do we miss this? Well, come to find out, had a couple divorces, back credit cards, and somebody offered them enough money and that was enough. And so they were like, okay, well, that's over. Everybody's gonna get a credit check. So now you'll get a bing on your credit report when you get your security background check going like, is that to say the US government just checked my credit score? And they'll check your credit to make sure that you don't have any skeletons in those closets that could lead to things that would make you make questionable decisions.
Considering things like, again, the biological or radiological kind of weapons, how much do people worry about bad actors bringing them across the border?
Again, is it possible? Yes. I mean, but how much are you going to bring across in the backpack? Like if we're talking, I think our bigger concerns are the ports because the number of containers. So I used to be in the Coast Guard, not this part of the Coast Guard, but I remember reading some of the reports when I was in. The number of containers that they can actually say they actually scanned or swept and things like that it's a minuscule number compared to what comes across. What you can bring across the border in a backpack, I mean, maybe you can bring something small, but I mean, it's got to be something you can carry. And then again, what's your goal? And most terrorism that we look at it's all about scalability, right? Like they want the most people dead or the most people threatened. So it only fits in the backpack. I mean, is it a threat possibility? But it's not when we sit there and worry about. I'd worry about the shipping containers or what's coming across because we just can't expect all of them, right? That's just. I can't remember the numbers, but it's pretty astronomical number of what comes in and the number of what we scan is pretty small, right?
What about manufacturing something like, I think fentanyl, and manufacturing something that's like in a pill form that they would sell as drugs or whatever that could cause like a mass casualty event?
I mean, like I said, methamphetamines are homegrown. I mean, those guys do it day in, day out and all around the country, right? So there's a feasibility there. What you could do, I don't know. I mean, that's not kind of my expertise, but obviously methamphetamines are possible. Like I said, if you ever look at the garbage that goes into that stuff, I won't go into that discussion, but you can Google it if you ever want to see the chemical list that they put into it, and they're doing it. They have a single bottle method up to complex labs that they're doing it around the country, right? So there's some possibilities there. It just, if you're trying to go down mainstream of what's the threats, like I said, the US government's done a pretty good job about controlling what we call precursors or the elements that lead to it. Like I said, like pseudoephedrine, where it's one of the stepping stones to get to something nasty. We try to regulate that pretty good. So, but you could always ask the DEA guy. He's probably a little smarter on the drugs than I am. I just had to know the difference. So that's why people always wonder, like, so I know how to make methamphetamines, and people are like, really? You're a firefighter. Why is that your job? I said, well, if I walk into a laboratory, right? What is a laboratory? So there's things I can rule out. Since I know how to make methamphetamines, I can look around the room and go, nope, not the right items. This is not a methamphetamine lab. Or walk in the room and go, yes, I see the right combination of items or right things in the room. This is a methamphetamine lab. It's a law enforcement drug issue, not a hazmat issue. But yeah, so we learn how to make some of the basic stuff, but they try to go a couple steps short of teaching us how to make the really nasty stuff. So, any other questions?
You mentioned anthrax in the soil in Wyoming.
Yep.
Maybe I missed it, or why is there so much of it in
The cattle
just the
industry.
cattle?
Yeah.
From killing,
Well, it's just from the cattle. I don't know exactly how it comes from the cattle industry. I just know if you track where the cattle industry has been in the US, you'll find anthrax. I mean, you talk to any large veterinarians that deal with horses and cattle, they were all vaccinated long before the US military or US government ever thought about vaccinating it, because it was something they had to worry about in their industry of working with it. So, but yeah, you can literally dig it up and test for it. Oh, go over there.
How regulated are farms? The reason I ask is I know that on my husband's family farm, they're big farmers and they get their anhydrous ammonia just ripped off like crazy.
Unfortunately, our friends that make methamphetamines like it. So any way they can steal it. And like I said, usually it's protected by a padlock, right? And maybe a farmer with a shotgun if he's awake, right? But again, but that they'll go out there and they'll steal it. So that's like I said, that's why we're more concerned about pesticides than like VX or sarin, because they're close, there's similarities to them. And they're obviously more abundant in what's protecting them. A
And
farmer
they
with
just sit around in farm trucks and
Right.
sprayers.
Yep, right. So
Other than eating a bad burrito, will keep you up at night.
that's true. A bad burrito would be disappointing.
It's like your first date.
Yeah. Not much, because I the joy of doing the job I do now for Texas A&M, I get to travel around the country and work with. I've worked with first responders now and training with them across. I think I've hit all 50 states now. I think with first responders, I'm pretty close, and quite a few of the territories. We have the greatest group of people out there working, doing their jobs. Like I know back in 2008 when I was working with the Denver hazmat team guys, they're second to none. Like they're hard workers. They love, they're passionate about it. They study this stuff day in, day out. Like I said, life's too short to worry about what could happen, right? So, as long as we keep training and stay ahead of the bad guys, that's kind of where we are, but nothing, that doesn't keep me up. Maybe getting in an argument with my wife keeps me up, but yeah. So no, yeah, I said it's interesting. It's been a fun job. Like I said, me and my wife joke about it because our daughter's kind of coming behind me into emergency management, disaster management. And how do you get to where I've been? I was just like, it's a bunch of happy little accents, to quote Bob Ross. Right. Just happened to be here and they said, hey, you know anything about hazmat? Would you like to work on it? I'm like, nope, never heard about it before, but it sounds like fun. And you get to go to some cool training facilities and meet some cool people. And like I said, I've gotten to travel the country to be trained, and now I get to travel the country and I return that favor and train people. So it's pretty enjoyable. Yeah, right. So I know a lot of times we see on TV and movies, like it goes from nothing to everybody's there. And that's not the way the world works, right? So like I said, it starts local. So if you picked up the phone right now, because there was a CBRNE related event in this room, 911, you're gonna get Denver PD, Denver Fire, and the EMS service that's here. And then they look at their response capabilities. And once it hits a threshold of where they're like, hey, this is either something we're unsure about, don't know, or just need assistance, then they'll kick the trigger to go to the next step up. Traditionally within the hazmat world, the CBRNE world, the next step up for a local jurisdiction would be the National Guard. Every state has a National Guard unit called the Civil Support Team. And they're responsible for CBRNE response within the US. Every state has one at least, and they work for the governor of the state. So at the governor's discretion, they can be deployed to assist local jurisdictions that are running into it. Really highly funded. I got to run their comm vehicle, which runs in about $5 million. They got lots of expensive toys, which a lot of local jurisdictions can't afford, especially in Wyoming. It was great because a lot of jurisdictions are on limited budgets, and to have this federally funded a group that's governor controlled can show up. They show up and they'll help. After that, then they'll start talking about what federal partners, if it starts scaling beyond that, like I said, if it's radiation or nuclear based, DOE will be on the short call list for their FBI hazmat response. HMRU hazardous material response unit is on that list, but kind of work our way up until we kind of hit the point of where we feel like we have control of it. There's this curve within disaster and incident response where the incident gets bigger faster than we can catch up to it, and then eventually we catch up to it, and then it gets smaller as we catch up to it, and then how you manage your resources up on the top end of that is kind of the biggest challenge most of us have in disaster management and incident response kind of things. But
you said that the National Guard is under the control of the governor.
yes.
Who's a political person.
Yep.
And chances are, different city, different agendas, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So if it's a local thing, I presume it would get kicked up in the local chain of command, that say the police chief or the fire chief or something like that. Would they contact the guard directly, or would they have to call the mayor, to call the governor, to call?
It depends on your state. So I can speak because I was on the Wyoming team. Ours was the county emergency manager had the bat phone to the state to call for us, right? So once one of the local jurisdictions felt like they hit that threshold, wanted our help, they called the county emergency manager. She would call the state operations center. We gave them a questionnaire because there was information we needed before we'd go out the door. Plus, we're trying to make sure that the feds would pay for us to go out the door. And they would run down that questionnaire going, what's the issues? What's this? What's this? What's this? And if they hit enough yes boxes, then they would call our commanding officer up, who's lieutenant colonel, and say, I have a mission for you. This county's asking for your assistance. Here's the location. Here's all the information. And you're authorized to head out the door.
So the governor doesn't have to sign off on it?
No, not officially, but does he? Because
yeah,
but
he's granted them that.
Yeah.
Authority.
Yeah. So that's kind of how it works in Wyoming, and most states follow suit with that. Something's very similar. Yeah, it's pretty easy to activate. A lot of times too, we have direct relationships anyways. So my colonel will get a phone call from a fire chief going like, hey, I just made the phone call. You'll get the phone call hopefully here in the next 30 to 40 minutes, but here's the update, what's going on real quick. And then eventually we get to, hey, you have a mission. And we're like, oh, surprise. But that was us trying to build relationships out in the community. But the other thing that comes with that conversation that we talked about is, so everybody, lots of movies and TV bring the federal, like bring in actual US military involved. That really can't happen in the real world. After the Civil War, a law called the Posse Comitatus Act was put in place, which prevents the use of federal troops within the United States. So any type of instance where you're like, I want to use the US military and in the United States, that becomes problematic because under law that's it's forbidden. Only the National Guard, who serves the governor, can actually operate within the US. So that's kind of one of those problematics. Now, do we have relationships with those kind of troops so we can ask questions and use subject matter experts? Absolutely. But actually having federal US military troops walking down the street carrying a rifle or something like that would never happen because the laws prevent that. So, but the National Guard skirts that rule because we work for the governor. So
then they can carry rifles.
They can, right? Yes. Because there's just, I won't belabor it because there's lots of federal law in there, but there are federal laws that allow the National Guard to operate that way, and there's federal laws that prevent the US military from acting that way. So that's kind of the one, but that's why after the National Guard, then it goes to the partner federal agencies, whether it's DEA, DHS, FBI, DOE, whoever, because again, those are federal partners. So that cover that pretty good.
Yeah, one other, this is, now I'm curious.
Oh,
Of all the of the CBRN, if this was you and you wanted to write, or maybe like if you were a terrorist and wanted to do something, what do you think is the most vulnerable and what would you do?
The chemicals is the easiest. Like I mentioned earlier, there's roughly 3,000 toxic industrial chemicals, toxic industrial materials running around the US, just natively, just to run a country and be a nation. So that's probably the easiest, because that's just so plentiful and it's out there, and it's how good the truck drivers keep security on a semi truck, right? I mean, a little easier theft than you come to Cheyenne, Wyoming on a blizzard, and there's 10,000 semi trucks parked in there. I don't think anybody would remember which truck driver got out of what truck. If you just happen to jump in one and drive away with it, that would be probably the easiest way to steal something that was important. So, like I said, the rest take a little more effort. Not that they're impossible, but they just take more effort. And when somebody's already made 3,000 chemicals for you, so
Like trucks just driving into a building, you tap the building and just.
so that's been a problem, right? So as that's kind of rose up in the threat levels, if you notice now, if you go by really important buildings that what we call bollards, the concrete or metal stanchions to prevent people from either driving into crowds, because we've had that problem lately. We've had a couple parades and stuff like that. And then like if you go down to Vegas now, like I've gone to Vegas off and on for a while now, and now down almost the whole strip, there's bollards that go down the whole sidewalk to prevent somebody from trying to jump a curb and just run through a crowd of people or something like that. So yeah, again, as those threats come up and become more meaningful, then things like that happen. Obviously, after 9/11, a lot of that building security, physical security of buildings, especially important buildings, kind of cranked itself way up. And so try to prevent that. But again, they only have to be right once, so you have to be right every other day. So